I'm Fred Weston. I'm a communist, and I'm here to answer more lies about communism.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communists.
The communists.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. You'll remember a couple of weeks ago that Fred, a leading member of the Revolutionary Communist International, took on lies about communism from famous right-wingers including Ben Shapiro, Elon Musk, Alice Weidel of the AfD, and Jordan Peterson. And he did such a good job that we brought him back to take on some more. Before we get on to our first clip, Fred, I wonder, was there something that came across in common from the people we were responding to a couple of weeks ago?
They all defend the capitalist system. They all defend bourgeois society. They all defend the privilege of the rich in a world situation where there are millions and hundreds of millions of people who are really suffering. And they try to clean up the image of capitalism and present it as the best thing since sliced bread. You know, that there's nothing better than this. The other side of it is, of course, to distort what communism really is and present it for something else. And the purpose of all this is clearly to stop people who are looking for an alternative to this system finding that alternative.
All right, well, we've got Charlie Kirk, who is an American conservative commentator, and he's the co-founder of a group called Turning Point USA. They also have a British branch. We've had a few run-ins with them on social media in the past. They seem to be less than impressed with the output of our organisation. If any of you are watching, hi. Rest assured, we're going to keep putting out our material and raising our ideas in spite of your objections. But here we have Charlie Kirk arguing that communism is not only bad, it's unnatural.
Human beings, in my belief and in any sort of observation of human nature, are viciously self-interested, and they will not act communally, whether ever given an opportunity to do so otherwise. So we are not communal social creatures, as postulated by either Rousseau or Marx. In fact, we're far more self-interested and sinful in our disposition. And that is why communism has never worked and will never work, unless you have an example you could point to.
So, there we are. Communism has never worked and can never work because human beings are inherently selfish and sinful and self-interested. What do we have to say about that?
Well, it's a very good description of themselves. I.e., it's a very good description of the privileged elite at the top of this society, in effect at the top of any class society. They are interested only in their own material wealth. And of course he says, and it's because of that that communism can't work. I don't agree. It's not because the bourgeois elite of this society are self-centered that communism can't work. Communism is a way of living, which I would argue, and I will attempt to prove it here, is actually more in harmony with the real spirit of human beings. I'll just give one example. There's an article that talks about the psychological benefits of volunteering, right? It says, in a world focused on individual achievement and personal success, it's easy to overlook the profound impact that volunteering can have on our health, our psyche, etc. It says, engaging in selfless acts, connecting with others and contributing to a greater cause can bring about a sense of purpose, fulfillment, and overall happiness. And further on, it actually says that engaging in acts of kindness and generosity releases endorphins in the brain, which contribute to feelings of joy and contentment. By helping others, volunteers experience a sense of purpose and fulfillment that can boost their overall life satisfaction. And you can imagine, in very primitive conditions, if humans had not coalesced as groups and worked socially to help each other, they could not have survived.
Well, let's be honest, human beings are far from the strongest animals, we're far from the fastest animals, we don't have the natural weapons of sharp claws and large fangs that other animals have. We can't fly. We don't really have many physical attributes that give us an individual advantage. What we do have is a very high level of intelligence. We have complex culture. We have extremely developed social relations, which mean that we can not only look out for one another, not only can we become greater than the sum of our parts, but we're capable of dominating every other species on the planet. We're the only species, really, that's able to turn nature to our will precisely because of our ability to work collectively, pass our knowledge down, to develop civilization.
Yes. I mean, social networking is one of the elements, actually, which distinguished Homo sapiens more than any other species in their survival. And here again, this is about psychology. It talks about social connections which play a vital role in our psychological and emotional health. As human beings, we thrive on social interaction and a sense of belonging, etc., etc. Now, that's from today. That is from today's conclusion. Psychologists of today will I think would agree with this. I think actually, this is an aside, the very high levels of mental health issues, problems that people have, I think, is because the society we live in is not consonant to the needs of human beings.
No.
We are forced to live as isolated individuals in the midst of millions of people.
We had a laboratory demonstration of that on a social level a couple of years ago. The pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, forced us all to live in isolation.
Yes.
And there are reams of data coming out already talking about the immense impact that had on people's psychological health.
That's right.
The reason there was ultimately such a big pushback against the continuation of lockdown measures and isolation measures partly was because of the way the ruling class totally bungled it and a lack of faith towards the establishment. Initially, people were extremely self-sacrificing, which goes to demonstrate the point again. People understood the need in the context of this unprecedented crisis, this massive health crisis, to put other people's needs before their own.
That's right.
And they made big sacrifices, but the damage is well understood. I know personally of people who felt immense loneliness, who felt incredibly depressed because they weren't able to see people, to hug people, to talk to people. We're clearly a social species. Maybe Charlie Kirk just doesn't have many friends, and he can't imagine that other people would enjoy the company of others.
Well, they probably enjoy the company of other bourgeois. But you see, if Homo sapiens, the latest findings indicate that we've been around as a species for about 300,000 years. If you consider that agriculture was the basis for the early accumulation of wealth and the beginnings of class differentiation, which started about 12,000 years ago, but class society as such probably came into being in between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago. Something.
By class society, we mean the point where people settle down and they produce a surplus of food, which allows them to divide tasks up amongst one another.
It allows actually the emergence of an elite.
Right, precisely.
Based on property. And that's, 5,000 to 8,000 years. That's like 2 to 3% of the history of Homo sapiens has been lived under a class-divided society. That means something like 97, 98% of our history we lived in a very different way, without private property. Now, I actually am reading the works of Lewis Henry Morgan. He wrote Ancient Society.
So a great anthropologist.
Yeah, an innovator, I would say. He discovered a lot of elements that are of interest to us. Ancient Society was a text that was based on his encounter, his experience of living with indigenous American people. And he wrote that there's one part of that book which wasn't published as part of the book because the editor said it was too long. He published it before his death, and it's called The Houses and House Life of the American Aborigines. Now, the reason I'm quoting it is this. It shows how people were living in the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. Now, just to clarify, Morgan was an American lawyer. He invested in mining and railroads. He was, for a period, a New York Republican senator, a New York State Republican senator. He viewed the United States as the pinnacle of democratic bourgeois society. He was I would class him as a genuine bourgeois Democrat, bourgeois liberal. He was in no way a communist. He did express sympathy for the Paris Commune. He was in Paris a few weeks after the end of the Commune. He was against the monarchy. He was for the Republic. In effect, as I said, a true bourgeois liberal Democrat. He also described the indigenous peoples of North America honestly, and he clearly had some admiration for them. The point here is not to judge his political views, as I said, but is the fact that he was able to bring out elements of the way these people lived. Now, what's one key quote I want to quote from this book is this. He's describing the life of the villagers, right? And he says this. There's a whole chapter in this book called The Law of Hospitality and Its General Practice. And he says, and I'll quote, "The law of hospitality, as administered by the American Aborigines, tended to the final equalization of subsistence. Hunger and destitution could not exist at one end of the Indian village or in one section of an encampment, while plenty prevailed elsewhere in the same village or encampment." Now, in the book, he describes the rule of hospitality as any person that entered your home, your dwelling, had to be treated with courtesy and had to be fed. And if necessary, even, they would prepare a bed for them. And it wasn't just for kinship or members of their tribe. It would be even to perfect strangers. Now, this law of hospitality, he sees directly, but then he also quotes from a number of sources from the 1500s onwards up till the 1800s. And he at length quotes from them. And each one of them confirms the same thing. And the reason he does it is because they're encountering different peoples, different indigenous peoples across the United States and beyond the United States. And he finds that all of them have this trait. Now, he points out that at one point he refers to their religion, the belief in the Great Spirit. This is what he says. He's quoting a missionary who, in the 1700s, who's describing the religion of the indigenous peoples. And he says, "They think that he," that is the Great Spirit, "made the earth and all that it contains for the common good of mankind. When he stocked the country that he gave them with plenty of game, it was not for the benefit of a few, but of all. Everything was given in common to the sons of men." This is the missionary describing these people. Later on, he quotes, Spaniards, he quotes Americans, he quotes military figures, and every time they encounter indigenous peoples, they're welcomed like this. It's very common, let's say, this type of encounter. And he says it was practiced among themselves and towards strangers from other tribes. Later on, he actually says, and they extended it to the Europeans when they arrived in the early period. He talks about the universality of the practice of hospitality among the Indian tribes of America at the epoch of European discovery. Now, what I found interesting is when he gives the explanation as to why this was the case. How could they always be so hospitable, and why would they always share some of their resources? And he says, "The law of hospitality, as administered by the American Aborigines, indicates a plan of life among them. And he says, its explanation must be sought in the ownership of lands in common, the distribution of their products to households consisting of a number of families, and the practice of communism in living in the household. It's interesting to note that he says the reason why this type of living and this hospitality was possible is because of the common ownership of the land. They didn't have private property. There's another chapter that follows on from that, which is actually called Communism in Living. Now, you can't blame Morgan. He didn't think communism was what happened in the Soviet Union. This is in the 1800s. He refers to the how they built in common, how they farmed in common, how they held land in common. And he talks about a final equalization of the means of subsistence was in some measure affected by the law of hospitality. To a very great extent, communism in living was a necessary result of the condition of the Indian tribes. Now, I could quote at length more on this, but what he does when he quotes all the other sources is he shows that it existed all across the Americas, down into Mexico, and even in South America. He describes some of the accounts of the early Spaniards meeting these people. Now, when I was reading it, I thought, what a tragic historical experience. Because here was a people that was accustomed to living like this, and they are so generous to these Europeans who arrived, and some of them were military people. And when you look at it and read it now, and you think, what were these Europeans doing and planning to do, and had already done in some areas, obviously, was in effect a huge genocide of these peoples. Now, but the point is this: why is it that they behaved like this? And it was across a whole continent. If what they're saying here is that, it's human nature not to act communally, well, answer the question: why was it that all of the peoples of the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans did act communally? They were social creatures. They looked after each other. That quote that you couldn't have, hunger and destitution in one end of the village when there was plenty in the other. It would be shared out. Whatever they had would be shared out. I would argue that is the natural way of humans behaving, and it is connected to the way they produced their forms of subsistence, i.e., the property relations determined the way people lived. The thing is, the Europeans who were arriving, they arrived from a Europe which had already been divided into classes, but not just the early forms of class society. We had the most advanced form, which is capitalist society, where you have private property, which is based on the profit of the individuals. And you can only make a profit at the expense of other people. You can only make a profit by exploiting others. So this idea that it's human nature basically to be greedy and self-centered like the capitalists. I just wanted to two other quotes. As I said, Lewis Morgan was a lawyer. He was an American. You can't think that he was doing it for some communist sympathy, which he definitely was not. But a more up-to-date figure, a later figure, Colin Renfrew is a British anthropologist, archaeologist. He's a former professor of archaeology at Cambridge University. And, listen, he was a conservative member of the House of Lords between 1991 and 2021. Not, again, in no way a communist, right? You can't accuse him of that. But he wrote a book called Prehistory, The Making of the Human Mind. And he states the following in describing early forms of society. Early hunter-gatherer societies, like those of our Paleolithic ancestors, and I've emphasized this, seem always to have been egalitarian communities, where individuals participated on a basis of equality. This is another statement by somebody, I think he knows what he's talking about, a professor of archaeology at Cambridge University, and in no way can be accused of having communist sympathies, says that it was egalitarian, right? This was, again, the natural way of being. Now, all the writings about human nature, and even in anthropology, it has had an effect in distorting views and insisting that certain things were not the way they were. Why? Because if you accept all this, then the logic is this. Change the economic conditions, change the way people procure their wealth, change the property relations, and you can change this so-called human nature, which is a very elastic and flexible thing. In the early days, human nature is what I described, was observed in the Americas, and it's clearly an element of early human society. As I said, the overwhelming majority of the history of our species lived in these conditions. Change the property relations, private property comes in, the accumulation of wealth, and the way people relate to each other changes. Now, why do they spend so much time denying that the past was the way it was? Because if you accept it, what it means is this. Today, we have such a development of the economy that we've reached a point where we could return to a communism, but not the primitive communism of early society, an advanced communism based on the most developed science and technique. Achieve that, change the property relations, and the way people relate to each other would change. It's already present under capitalism. This analysis of volunteering and helping out, that happens under capitalism. How do you explain the number of people who are prepared to donate to charities, give time to help other people, if it's not a natural way of being? The property relations are an obstacle to that. But I just wanted to quote another American anthropologist, Leslie White, who wrote a text called The Evolution of Culture, the Development of Civilization to the Fall of Rome. And
for the sake of transparency, we should say that Leslie White is on the left.
He was. He was a socialist. He read Marx. He actually was a member of the Socialist Labour Party. He clearly was. In his case, he was a socialist, and probably would have at least claimed to be a Marxist, I think. In any case, this is his comment on this question. So menacing did the theory of primitive communism become, apparently, that members of 3 anthropological schools have felt called upon to scotch it. Lowy of the Boas School has attacked it repeatedly. Malinowski, a leader of the functionalist school, branded it perhaps the most misleading fallacy there is in social anthropology. Lowy has been commended by Catholic scholars for his criticism of the theory of primitive communism, and through this, his opposition to socialist doctrines.
We should also say of Malinowski that he said that the idea that the family unit, the patriarchal family unit, might not be natural, might not have been universal to humanity, is the most dangerous premise since the Russian Revolution of 1917.
That's right.
Which goes to show what he's all about.
But then he adds, this is the last bit of the quote, "It would appear that an effort was being made to make the world safe for private property." And that is what is being done. And even this little video is propaganda, basically, to promote the idea that what the central idea is: give up on trying to change society. Give up on this idea that you can have some kind of communist society where everybody collaborates and there's a communal way of living and a social way of living. Because that's nonsense, because it goes against what we know about human nature. That's the central message they're trying to get across, because it is a threat to the system in which these people can continue to be viciously self-interested as they are.
Yeah, we're happy to admit that it's perfectly natural for capitalists to be selfish and self-interested and greedy, because theirs is a system where tiny elite minority exploits everybody else in order to enrich themselves, to secure control over society. I mean, Marx talks about the dominant ideology in every epoch being that of the ruling class. Of course, the ruling class under capitalism, i.e. the capitalist, would say, what we think is just what's true.
Yeah.
What we think is just how things are. And as Marx says in the manifesto, capitalism does what? It turns every human relation into a money relation.
That's right.
So it's an authentic reflection of what comes natural to Mr. Charlie Kirk, but he cannot speak for the rest of us. And I think we should move on, because we've got 2 other clips to get through. I'm going to return to an old friend. Fred, we have Jordan Peterson, so let's have a listen.
Because of the problem of centralization, I mean, you have to hypothesize that you can take away all the property of the capitalists. You can replace the capitalist class with a minority of proletariats. How they're going to be chosen isn't exactly clear in the Communist Manifesto. That none of the people who are from the proletariat class are going to be corrupted by that sudden access to power, because they're, well, by definition, good. So then you have the good people who are running the world, and you also have them centralized so that they can make decisions that are insanely complicated to make, in fact, impossibly complicated to make. And so that's a failure conceptually on both dimensions, because, first of all the proletariat aren't going to be good. And when you put people in the same position as the evil capitalists, especially if you believe that social pressure is one of the determining factors of human character, which the Marxists certainly believe, then why wouldn't you assume that the proletariat would immediately become as or more corrupt than the capitalists, which is, of course, I would say exactly what happened every time this experiment was run. And then the next problem is, well, what makes you think that you can take some system as complicated as, like, capitalist free market society and centralize that and put decision-making power in the hands of a few people, the mechanisms without specifying the mechanisms by which you're going to choose them? Like, what makes you think they're going to have the wisdom or the ability to do what the capitalists were doing, unless you assume, as Marx did, that all of the evil was with the capitalists and all the good was with the proletariats, and that nothing that capitalists did constituted valid labor, which is another thing that Marx assumed, which is palpably absurd.
So just for a bit of context, in that clip, Peterson was debating communism and Marxism with Slavoj Žižek, who is a self-described philosopher who does, I have to say, almost as bad of a job defending Marxism in this debate as Peterson does slandering it. But Fred, let's talk of good and evil here, and the idea that our attitude is that the proletariat are all good and the capitalists are all evil, which is why we don't mind that you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, because they're all good and they can't possibly be corrupted. What do you think of Peterson's take on our attitude to the question of workers' rule and planning society?
Well, before going into it, I like the fact that he actually admits that capitalists are corrupt. Because what he says is that if you take, in his simplistic outlook and his complete misunderstanding of Marxism, that you just take a few proletarians and you put them in the same position as the capitalists, and they'll just become as corrupt. You're admitting that the system is corrupt. It's a nice start.
If you were in charge, you'd be as bad as we are.
That is what he's basically saying. But the logic of this is, of course, is in spite of all that, capitalism works, and it creates wealth and all the rest of it. He talks about Marx is proposing to replace the capitalists with a minority of proletarians, and he asks how are they to be chosen. And he says that, if you do that, you put a small number of workers, basically, poor, who are not wealthy, suddenly access to power, then they will become as corrupt. And then he says all the proletariat aren't going to be good. This is utter nonsense. I mean, Marxists have never spoken about the capitalists being all bad and the workers being all good. I'm sure there are individual capitalists who are, on an individual basis, quite reasonable people. and there are also workers who can be pretty nasty individuals. It's not about the individuals. It's about the classes as a whole. You can try and be a good capitalist, but if there's a crisis of capitalism and the market for your goods disappears, with all the best intentions, you're going to have to sack your workers, and those workers will lose their wages and they'll lose their means of subsistence. So it's not about good and bad. It's about how the system works. What this reveals is that Jordan Peterson does not understand Marxism. He has a very simplistic interpretation of it. He distorts it, and he ignores what Marxists actually said on this. You see, Marxists, communists, have never suggested putting a small number of proletarians into positions of power. We're talking about the whole of the working class through its democratically elected bodies governing, i.e., in effect, the working class becomes the ruling class. Mm-hmm. But what's the difference in when the working class becomes the ruling class? Well, the working class is the overwhelming majority of the population.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that capitalism has done in the last 80 years, it has massively increased the number of proletarians that Jordan Peterson refers to. And by proletarians, we don't mean a few very poor people. We mean all those people who, in order to live, need to work for somebody else that pays them a wage, i.e. wage earners. Now, that means today, if we look at the world, the overwhelming majority of people earn their living through earning a wage from somebody else. These are the people that should decide the fate of humanity. Now, it's not a question of, 3 billion workers every morning meeting in an assembly and deciding what to do next. Clearly, you're going to have elected bodies. You're going to have democratically elected bodies, starting in the workplaces. In the workplace, you'll have a works council elected. They will elect the most skilled, the most able, the most experienced workers to take on the roles of running a workplace. But it won't be like the manager that is employed by the boss to control the workers and get maximum profit out of the workers. It would be people who represent the interests of the workers. It's a different class they represent. Now, Lenin actually explained very clearly in State and Revolution how a genuine, healthy worker state would function. He listed the points. He listed 1, free and democratic elections with the right of recall of all officials. Now, that means in every workplace, every neighborhood, every college, whatever, hospital, clinic, school, etc., you would have the election of a governing body with officials elected to run things. But notice what Lenin added, the right of recall. That means they would be elected and they wouldn't be there for the next 5 years like in a parliament or a council or whatever, or like some trade union leaders are elected and stay there for years. And then once elected, they cannot be removed and the people that elected them have no power over them. The right of recall means that if I've elected you to carry out the interests of the workers in this workplace and you work against that interest, I can demand a recall election. And if necessary, we will change you. That's one way of keeping in check the possible emergence of a bureaucracy. The other, which is equally important, no official to receive a higher wage than a skilled worker. Now, you see, if you elect officials to positions where the wages are 2, 3, 4, 5 times that of the workers that elect them, their material condition changes. In that sense, Jordan Peterson is telling a little truth, i.e., if I take a worker and I elect him to a managerial position, which brings with it big income, he will begin to change. He will be affected by the material conditions. And he'll basically turn into a manager like any other manager in a bourgeois company. Because his wages are much higher, his material interests will be different to the workers that he's supposed to represent.
You see that with the leaders of the big trade unions, many of whom earn wages that are well in excess of the ordinary worker they represent.
Six-figure wages.
Six-figure wages. I won't be naming names, but if you have a cursory look online, look up what the general secretaries of some of the biggest trade union leaders in Britain and America and elsewhere earn. It's often eye-watering. And naturally, once you have a wage like that,
you're not going to like the idea that in a month or two, if you really behaved against the interests of the workers, they can immediately remove you. You're going to fight that. In fact, there is no such clause in the unions. We demand that such clauses are put in, but it's not just that. Not £250,000. If the workers that elected you are on 30, 35, 40,000, depends on different sectors, some even lower, you should be earning the same money as the workers you represent. We're not utopian. We know that in order to build advanced communism, you've got to have a developed economy. In the Soviet Union, they came to power in conditions of extreme backwardness. But it was they considered it part of the beginning of a world revolution, whereby workers' power would spread to countries like Germany and Britain and France and others, where you had the advanced technology and therefore you could develop the economy on the basis of that. In the Soviet Union, they didn't have that. Now, you had to first build up the economy before you could even think of moving in the direction of communism. In building up the economy, you need the skilled technicians. You need the managerial skills. You need teachers who can read and write. You need state functionaries who can read and write. In the Soviet Union at that time, 85% of the population were peasants, most of them illiterate. In that situation, for the Bolsheviks in government, to get these people they needed to work for the state, who were not born communists, it's not genetically programmed to communism, to get them to work, you had to give them a material incentive. And what they tried to do was, in the very difficult conditions, give them a material incentive which would bring them on board and say, work, do what we need, right? Give us your skills. But they tried to limit it to 4 to 1, i.e., you can earn up to 4 times the wage of a worker. Now, this is not the purpose of this podcast, but had the revolution spread, that wouldn't have been a problem. Isolated in a backward country, and you depend on this minority of people with the skills who have already been granted a privilege in order to get them to work. That was the beginning of the bureaucratization. That layer wanted to enjoy the privileges they'd achieved, and they gradually lifted themselves above the rest of society. Now, so the origin of this bureaucracy lies precisely in the privilege of a minority that emerged. But Lenin also points out that in a worker state, you wouldn't have a separate standing army or separate police force paid for to police the working class, but you'd have the armed people, as you referred to it, i.e. the workers as a whole would have control over that. And then he also talked about the rotation of roles within the administration. The famous, every cook should be able to be prime minister. When everyone is a bureaucrat in turn, nobody can be a bureaucrat, i.e., but that requires economic development, education on a high level of the whole population, learning of skills, etc. That takes time, of course. But the essential element, I think, is democratic election of the officials that represent you, and that they should not earn more than the wage of an average worker.
Yes.
If you establish that, then you are combating precisely what he refers to, this idea that, a few workers get into power and they just become the same as the others. Now, he's doing the same thing as we've said in the other one. He's trying to establish this idea that there's inevitability to elites, to capitalism as the best possible system, and nothing else can work. I just wanted to quote one thing because I listened to other videos where he's talking about how he's preparing for this debate with Zizek on communism. And he talks about the Communist Manifesto in a way that said it's completely irrelevant. It's basically nonsensical.
Yeah.
I want to ask who's listening to this podcast,
Yeah, Jordan Peterson, if you're watching, then this is directed to you. This
is Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells. And then later it says, it is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threateningly. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. I'm asking the question, does this describe what we're living through today or not? Have we got a crisis? Is the world in crisis? Is the world economy in crisis? Another question, have the productive forces not been destroyed more than once in the past? One through the periodical economic crisis, but two, through the wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and now we have the Ukraine war and other wars around the globe. What Marx wrote is not nonsense. Actually, the manifesto, the Communist Manifesto, to be honest, is more relevant today than when it was first written. It describes perfectly what is happening. And I would invite anybody that hasn't read it to read it, because if you're honest, when you read it, I remember when I first read it, I thought, wow, this explains what's happening. And I'm talking about 1974, when I was at school and I was looking at this recession. Unemployment was shooting through the roof. Inflation was at 25%. There was a huge crisis in 1974, and you're looking for answers. I found the answers in the Communist Manifesto, and it was a brilliant description of what was happening, and it describes what's happening today.
And it's not just this question of overproduction that you mentioned in terms of monopolization of more and more wealth by a smaller and smaller cabal of capitalists, the working class becoming by far the majority class, the combination of workers into organs of struggle. That was only just beginning to happen at the time that Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto. Yeah. It speaks to the modern world more so than it does to the world of 1848. It's far more prescient and insightful than anything Jordan Peterson's ever said or written himself.
But he in another video he refers to Marx and Engels presuming that private property would be abolished under the dictatorship of the proletariat, which he ridicules. He refers to Marx and Engels as being psychologically naive because they hadn't, it wasn't their fault. They couldn't understand human nature, which we now understand better. This is his position.
Yeah, his whole premise is that there's hierarchy that is innate to human nature and in all species, and that really society is or should be a reflection of those natural hierarchies.
He refers to these geniuses that we have to find to run the economy. And but you see, I've actually had an experience of visiting a factory in Brazil under workers' occupation. It was run for about 5 years, Cipla, in Joinville in the south of Brazil, which our comrades in Brazil were involved in occupying and running. I walked around the factory, and I tell you something, I've never seen anything like it. A sense of pride of the workers in that factory, a very different atmosphere. Not the manager is coming who is going to, tell us what to do in that. I was taken to the laboratory, and the technicians were showing me the techniques they developed, proudly showing me how they'd done it. And there was a collective effort to keep that factory going, and it worked. Not long after, the state intervened, armed police came in, shut the whole thing down, and put the leaders on trial, banned them from coming within a mile of the factory.
Yeah.
And one article in one of the local papers referred to these people as, these are the enemies that if first they come into your garden and take a rose, and then gradually start taking more, and eventually they want the whole house. I.e., if we let this factory survive, as an example, when workers in other factories feel the pressure of the system and they're going to close their factories, they will copy this model and occupy and run the factories.
American imperialism had basically the same attitude on a bigger scale to the worker states that emerged after the Russian Revolution.
That's right.
It was precisely that. We have to, Kissinger said, we have to destroy the communists in this country, that country, wherever it looks like they're moving in the direction of communism or socialism. We have to intervene, we have to overthrow the government, we have to back our militias, we have to back the counter-revolution.
That's right.
Because we can't let examples slip through the net that could lead to capitalism being threatened elsewhere. Because
our own working class could get some ideas. He admits the capitalists are corrupt, and that, if you put a small group of workers in power, they'd be equally corrupt. But the general message these people try and get across is that, you have this, but capitalism's a good system, because it produces economic miracles, even refers to the economic miracle around the world, the raising of people out of poverty, all the rest of it. And yet he ignores, look, Action Against Hunger website, you look it up, 730 million people go hungry every day. That's 10% of the world population. 2.8 billion people can't afford a healthy diet. That's 35% of the world population. 50% of deaths among children are due to hunger. And yet, the world produces enough food to feed the entire population. The problem is not that we don't produce enough food. In fact, the chair of the UN Committee on Food Security in 2022 said, we produce enough food to feed 1.5 times the global population. The problem is access to the food, distribution, and affordability. People are going hungry, not because there isn't enough food, they're starving to death, literally, because they can't afford it. Now, that is the miracle that he's referring to. This is the abominable system that we live in, and it needs to be abolished. Jordan Peterson is he's defending the interests of a class in society, the propertied class. He's not defending the interests of humanity as a whole.
Yeah, and just quickly, because I want to move on to the final clips, but he talks about, how would you deal with trying to plan the immense complexity of a capitalist economy? Well, first of all, the capitalists also, to a certain extent, do plan their economy. They don't do it in a rational and democratic way, and they do it in the pursuit of profit, but they've got technology, they've got artificial intelligence, they have digital stock checking, they use market signals, and they have these summits like Davos and the World Economic Forum where they talk about their system and how it should be run. There's a huge amount of inefficiency and irrationality and waste. I mean, one example that stands out to me a couple of years ago is Shell made headlines at a time when oil prices were low by burning hundreds of tons of oil because it was cheaper than trying to flog it on the market. Yeah. Rather than give it away below cost price, they just set it on fire.
Well, look, I was looking at the figures of productive capacity utilization around the world. I looked at the figures for the United States since the 1970s through to today. And you see ups and downs. The downs are the moments of recession where a lot more is unutilized. And then there are the ups when there's a recovery. But if you look at the trend over the last 50 years, capacity utilization has gone from something like 90% to about 75, 77%. That means that something like a quarter of the productive capacity is not used. These are plants, these are machines that could be used. It's not used. Why? Because the market cannot absorb the goods. If they did produce everything, there'd be massive overproduction. So what you have is underutilization of capacity. What kind of system is it that has this immense productive capacity, not just in the States? It's the same everywhere, in Europe, in all the advanced capitalist countries. Utilization is well below 80%. It means that if tomorrow you plan the economy and use the full capacity, you could increase production by 20-30%. That is what could be done. Or, of course, obviously, in a society where the workers have control, you use the technology to spread the work out and to reduce the working day. We have now the means of production, we have the technology, we have the capacity to actually allow people to work 20 hours or even 10 hours, depending on the technology. And can you imagine a world where humanity has all its basic needs, such as food, everybody is fed properly and they have a sufficient diet, and the resources could then be redirected towards education, raising the cultural level, etc. You can imagine a very different world. The problem is, it's the self-seeking people that we referred to earlier, the capitalist class, whose main aim is one thing: maximize profit. That is the golden rule of capitalism, and that comes before anything else. Eliminate that motive, and society would have unlimited ability to develop far beyond what we have today.
Right, I mean, even the liberal bourgeois economist Keynes, after the war, thought that it might be possible on the basis of technological development alone to massively shorten the working day. And indeed, capitalism has created the means whereby the workers really could plan a very, very complex economy nationally and even internationally. You've got detailed electronic databases, you have automation, you have AI, you have robotics. All that's lacking is the common ownership of those means of production. And also, we're not talking about like a little tiny cabal somewhere in the way that Peterson describes it, trying to, look through the spreadsheets and try to understand every complex facet of the economy. That's a caricature. But if you plan things from the bottom, if you had workers in every sector, every industry, democratically deciding amongst themselves based on their understanding of what's needed, how much of this resource, how much investment, and feeding that back up the line, then you have the means to plan the economy. You have the technology. All that's standing in the way is the private ownership of the means of production. All right, I think we'll have to move on. And that is the last we will hear from Peterson. And finally, we have Peter Hitchens. He's a right-wing journalist and commentator who used to be a member of the International Socialists, now the Socialist Workers' Party, a Trotskyist group, but he moved very, very dramatically to the right and is now a deeply religious and deeply conservative political pundit. And he has some things to say based on his communist sins, as he sees it, about free speech.
I'm an ex-Bolshevik, and this does two things for me. One, it means that I have a lot to be guilty about. Secondly, it gives me insights into the politics and nature of the modern left, which most people don't have. One of the things that I did when I was still a revolutionary socialist was try and prevent people from exercising freedom of speech and thought. It came naturally to me. It came naturally to me because I believed that what I thought and desired was so good that anybody who disagreed with me must, by their nature, be evil and be deserving of being silenced. And this is the problem. The general left-wing belief, which is held by the elites of most Western countries now, is also a belief in their own virtue. And if you believe very strongly in your own virtue, and your virtue is based, it's almost a caricature of justification by faith alone. You are a good person because you hold certain opinions. Therefore, if you hold other opinions, you're a bad person. And I think that makes dialogue pretty much impossible. If you think your opponent is bad, not just wrong, but bad, why should you listen to a word he says? Well, they don't.
And to supplement that, we have a clip by probably the most famous right-winger in the world today, Donald J. Trump, president of the USA, talking about how his administration is going to reclaim freedom of speech.
If we don't have free speech, then we just don't have a free country. It's as simple as that. If this most fundamental right is allowed to perish, then the rest of our rights and liberties will topple, just like dominoes, one by one. They'll go down. That's why today I'm announcing my plan to shatter the left-wing censorship regime and to reclaim the right to free speech for all Americans. And reclaim is a very important word in this case because they've taken it away. In recent weeks, bombshell reports have confirmed that a sinister group of deep state bureaucrats, Silicon Valley tyrants, left-wing activists, and depraved corporate news media have been conspiring to manipulate and silence the American people. They have collaborated to suppress vital information on everything from elections to public health. The censorship cartel must be dismantled and destroyed, and it must happen immediately. And here's my plan. First, within hours of my inauguration, I will sign an executive order banning any federal department or agency from colluding with any organization, business, or person to censor, limit, categorize, or impede the lawful speech of American citizens.
All right, Fred. So this is a criticism that I'm sure that we've both heard many times. The idea that the left, that socialists, that communists are unwilling to accept free speech, that only capitalism provides the free marketplace of ideas, and that the only alternative to capitalist society is one where the party censors and controls everything, and that people like Donald Trump are finally taking the lever off freedom of speech and letting everybody say what they really think. So what do we have to say about this?
Well, interesting that he describes himself as an ex-Bolshevik.
This is Hitchens now.
Yeah, Peter Hitchens. Made me smile.
You met a few like that, I suppose, in your time.
He's basically an ex-member of the SWP, the British SWP, which you referred to as a Trotskyist group. I'd be careful with these labels, poor old Trotsky. He says, I have a lot to be guilty about. That's about himself. And he claims he knows the modern left, you see, and he obviously paints the whole left with one brush. He says he tried to stop people exercising the right to freedom of speech. Well, this is what he did as a youth. That's what he claims that he did. He shouldn't accuse the rest of us of doing that's what I would say to him, Peter Hitchens. Don't accuse us of doing what you did in your youth. I think we can defeat the right through argument, through facts and figures, through analysis. I don't need to stop somebody expressing their opinion in order to answer that opinion. In actual fact, the strength of an argument is not in closing down other people's speech. It's actually answering them calmly, but seriously. He also refers to another thing, the left-wing beliefs of the elites of the Western countries, the elites. So we have an elite in Britain which is left-wing, an elite in America which is left-wing. I often wonder what the word left-wing means these days. You see, another thing is he has his opinions about what he was like when he was young. I have never thought that people who think different from me are necessarily bad people. No, there's a lot of good people out there that have different opinions to us. That's not the point. There's a lot of good people who are seriously trying to change things or trying to contribute to making a better world. The differences I would have with a lot of people is the way they think they can improve it, what ideas, what program. And I think we need to engage with these people, not shut them up. We need to argue our case with most, of course, obviously. There are some people who are so racist, so bigoted, so stuck in their thinking, the anti-Semitic types, anti-Semitism in the true sense of the word, i.e. Nazis and fascists and right-wing racists. It's difficult to have a debate with those people. But with the bulk of people, even with bulk of people who are involved in politics, my approach is you listen, to what they're saying, take note of what they're saying, and then see if there's anything that you can agree on. I always start by, if there's something we agree on, let's okay, we agree on that. Let's look at the rest. And then where you don't agree, you argue your case.
Well, look at this show and the episode we did previously. Okay, we made it clear that we think that these are lies, and we've been very critical of the people we've been bringing on in their clips to present their points of view, but we've let them speak. We've not mischaracterized or paraphrased what they've been arguing. We've shown their ideas insofar as we can, and we're presenting our position.
Yes, I've spent decades working to build up our movement. I've met people, selling the paper or intervening in events, who expressed the idea, well, I'm a fascist,
Just so have I.
Yeah. My approach was, why? Why are you fascist? And the conversation starts, and then you realize that the reasons is that they actually believe, these are the more honest ones, obviously, not the hardline core of the fascists. They believe that there's something revolutionary, there's something in fascism, that's some kind of ideal. And I just go through some historical facts, I explain what they did patiently, and I've won over some young people like that to the ideas of communism.
We're not saying that these people are fascists, but I was speaking to one of our leading comrades in the States who said that they went out to a demonstration near a building site and they were wearing a sweatshirt that said communism will win. And one of the building workers came over and said, oh, that's a great sweatshirt. And the comrade said, oh, are you a communist? And he said, no, I voted for Trump. But something's very wrong in this country and we need a big change.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I can see where you're coming from. So it's not as though we expect everyone we meet to 100% agree with us and that we're not willing to engage with them if they don't. That's not at all the case. And that was never the case. That wasn't the case for Lenin and the Bolsheviks either. They were very much a minority for the vast majority of their history. There were times when they talked about going to demonstrations and trying to speak to workers outside the factories, and they get beaten up because the workers were hearing all sorts of stuff in church, for example, saying, oh, these are godless communists and they're going to lead you astray. They're the tools of Satan himself. And it took a lot of patience and restraint on behalf of the communists to keep doing the work. But nevertheless, they did, because we're trying to bring people with us, ultimately.
Yeah. One of the famous phrases of Lenin was, patiently explain. You argue your case calmly and patiently with facts and figures and arguments, historical example, etc., and demonstrate the superiority of your ideas, if you can. You're not going to convince everybody. But you see, I would say this, actually, the bulk of the work of convincing people of the necessity for communist ideas, it won't be done by us communists. It will be done by the capitalists themselves. Mm-hmm. They are the ones who are going to convince people to move in this direction, because the way they're running this world, the disaster that they're preparing for humanity, the inflation, the low wages, the conditions at work. Yesterday, I was selling the paper. A young girl comes up, buys the paper. I asked her, what do you do? She says, I'm a freelancer. And we were talking about, she came to London to work. She said, I'm working a 7-day week just to be able to pay the rent. It's so expensive, And I was thinking, she's bought a communist paper, right? Mm. Now, what pushed that young lady to buy a communist paper is the conditions she's living in.
Yes.
Who's creating those conditions? Not us communists. No. It's the capitalists.
And another thing the capitalists are doing is attacking free speech, precisely attacking the democratic rights that they say only their system can provide. That clip from Trump, it's interesting actually, because there's a kernel of truth to what he's saying. Because when he's talking about restrictions of free speech and attacks by the state, the deep state, and
they are taking place.
That was especially true on the run-up to his second term, because the liberal wing of the ruling class, the Democrats who were in charge at that time, were terrified at the prospect of Trump coming to power, because they thought probably correctly, that he was going to massively destabilize things and break with their policy. So they did actually use the levers of states and the media and the press against him. They weren't communists. They weren't doing it as communists. They were doing it from their point of view. However, having come into power, what's Trump done? In the last week, you've had the arrest of this student from Colombia, Mahmoud Khalil, who's a Palestinian on a green card, so democratically granted entry to the country in order to study. He organized peaceful protests at his university last year, which were brutally beaten back by the police, by state troops in some instances, because this was a movement of campus occupations for Gaza against Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people that erupted all over the country. And these attacks all happened under a Biden administration, by the way. You had the press all demonizing these students as anti-Semitic, as terrorists, as terrorist sympathizers. And now Donald Trump's come to power, and what's he done? He's doubled down on this policy of repression of free speech. So this kid, Mahmoud Khalil, he was returning home with his pregnant wife when the Department of Homeland Security detained him without cause and without a warrant. His wife immediately called a lawyer who demanded that the agents who arrested Mahmoud email her a copy of the warrants, and the agents apparently hung up on the lawyer and took him into custody. He's been moved to an ICE detention facility in Louisiana, where he has no support network, in a state where the administration is more likely to favour the president. And the reason that he's been arrested officially, the justification, is that there's an obscure provision in immigration law that claims that his presence in the US would have adverse foreign policy consequences. So essentially, he is faced with deportation, and he's been arrested without cause, having committed no crime, with no charge against him, for the simple reason that he organised a protest.
That's right.
This is a flagrant attack on First Amendment rights by a president who says that he's standing up for free speech.
That's right. I mean, you always have to ask the question when people like this stand up and talk about free speech. Free speech for who? Now, there's references in this last video of this so-called left-wing censorship, as if it's the left wing that are carrying it out, which involves, of course, presenting Biden and his friends and the media that backs him as left-wing. What's left-wing about Biden? And also, what the very term left is started to lose its meaning. What does it mean? When you, I don't know, Starmer, is he on the left?
According to some people from this milieu, he's a communist.
Yeah, well, they've even accused some of the Democrats of being communists. It's incredible. Now, the question is this, however. Did they maneuver against Trump? Well, of course they did. They did. They did not want Trump in power. The other question we have to ask is, who controls the media? Because you can talk about free speech and, all this, the right to express your views. But you see, you can also have control of, let's say, the right to free speech in a subtle way, in the sense that those who control the main sources of news, such as the BBC or the main newspapers or the paper that Hitchens has worked for, they have the possibility of churning out their views, their reports, their opinions to millions of people. And they have an agenda.
Well, I have some stats on that, actually. 6 companies, that's National Amusements, News Corp, Time Warner, Comcast, Sony Paramount, and Disney, own essentially all significant private US media outlets. And these megacorporations are in turn owned by billionaire oligarchs like Rupert Murdoch, who has an investment in this system. He's got a political agenda of his own. So you can talk about free speech, but it's not an even playing field. You have a small number of people who have the means and a platform to present ideas much more widely than you or I. And okay, they say it's freer on social media. Elon Musk keeps on talking about how he saved free speech by buying Twitter. But there's all sorts of evidence that he manipulates that platform in order to boost voices that support his politics.
Yes. Well, look, the social media, the internet, is presented by some people. Well, here finally we have a chance for people to express their views beyond the traditional means of communication. You don't need to have the BBC. You can have your Facebook page or your Instagram page or your X account and all the other social medias that exist. And therefore you can express your opinion. Well, any of us can set up one of these accounts. And we can get sizable followers, even a few thousand. It doesn't compare to the millions and billions that the official media are able to reach. Furthermore, we all know how these social media work. They have their algorithms. They have their ways of deciding what should be promoted and what should not be promoted. To the point, actually, where if you express a certain opinion, if you use certain words, you get a warning. And if you continue, you get suspended. And if you continue further, you eventually get banned. So there's a limit to how this can be used, which indicates that there is an agenda behind it, i.e. what news can be spread and what cannot. What version of events should be presented. Social media and the internet do provide greater flexibility in the sense that, for example, if you're my age, or a bit older maybe, you probably do watch the BBC. And what you see on the BBC you think is the news, right? If you're in your 20s or 30s, you don't watch the BBC. Young people, and a lot of people, they don't trust the official media anymore. Now, why is that? There is a healthy side to it, of course. They don't trust it because they don't believe what's being fed to them. You cannot live in conditions of growing inflation, increasing prices of your weekly shopping. You can see it, you can touch it that it's going up, right? And then they tell you inflation's not going. I tell you, inflation's gone down, and people say, "Well, it doesn't correspond with my, my bills and my shopping, etc."
Yeah, or they say that Israel's just defending itself. It's got a right to self-defense. Yeah. It's not committing a genocide. And you see on social media, for example,
it's the opposite.
You see the
you see the
kids blown to pieces, and the buildings destroyed, the schools and hospitals destroyed.
Interesting little point. Going back a few years to when Corbyn. When he had that the electoral success he had, where Theresa May thought that she could just smash the Labour Party. In fact, the Labour Party surged massively, and she lost her majority in Parliament. The election campaign of the Labour Party then, under Corbyn, and the Tories made a mistake. Their advertising was on the TV and in the main papers like the Telegraph and others. The Labour under Corbyn, they were using social media, which was cheaper to use, and they reached millions of young people. There is that side of it. Young people are looking for alternative sources of news because they don't trust the system that they live in. But of course, as I said, with the methods they have, the algorithms they have, they still pump out the story they want to pump out. This thing you mentioned about this Palestinian Khalil, he's been arrested, and his green card has been taken away, and they want to expel him because of a so-called danger to foreign policy of the United States. Who could be upset by a Palestinian who is campaigning for the rights of Palestinians in the United States? I would imagine it's the government of Israel that would be upset by this. And this is a gesture to them, i.e., we don't tolerate these people. Of course, you've got to present them as anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas in order to criminalize them. But the truth is, millions of young people protested around the world against the butchery in Gaza. And people have the right to do that. They should have the right to do it. And yet here in Britain, we've had our comrades picked up by the police.
Yes.
as accused of being anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. Here's how the media is used. You declare what anti-Semitism is, and then you say, if you don't adhere to our definition of it, you're anti-Semitic. That means you can be completely anti-racist, you can be completely against anti-Semitism.
Well, Jewish students were heavily involved in these protests. They were very visible.
A lot of Jews were on the protests in support of Palestine. A lot of Jewish people. But they decide what is and is not anti-Semitic. And then once you're accused of that, you're criminalized. You know, and they have laws for it. Musk says free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy. It depends on free, as I said before, free speech for who? Here is something from Trump's account. It says, all federal funding will stop for any college, school, or university that allows illegal protests. Agitators will be imprisoned or permanently sent back to the country from which they came. American students will be permanently expelled or, depending upon the crime, arrested. No masks. Thank you for your attention on this matter. Now, the question is this. Agitators can be arrested. But I thought, if you're agitating for an idea, surely. Isn't that not a freedom of expression, i.e. freedom of speech? You're expressing an opinion. Now, you might not agree with it. You might not like it. But surely that's a democratic right that people have. It's the right of people to say, I think what has happened in Gaza is a genocide. I think that what the Israeli state is doing is wrong. It's butchery. We should stop it. We should defend the right of the Palestinians to a homeland. Isn't that a genuine opinion that people can hold? Are they saying to us that if you say that, I'm going to take your right away? That means you stand up in one day and you say freedom of speech, and then the next you take away the freedom of speech. Why? Because you're expressing ideas which you consider unacceptable. So it's freedom of speech only for certain people and certain opinions. That's what it's about.
And just to offer the other side to it, what they implicitly refer to when they attack communists. On the one hand, I think they tar us with some of the more liberal layers of the identity politics crowd who do get a little bit over the top about certain views being expressed in certain places. Not really interested in that. But on the other hand, they point to the Stalinist regime, where there was a severe limitation of freedom of speech. There was no political freedom, really, under Stalin's regime. It varied over the course of the history of the Soviet Union, but there was political repression, no doubt. But, and we've said this in previous episodes, first of all, Stalinism is not Marxism, it's not Bolshevism, it's not Leninism, it's not the regime we defend. And under Lenin, under Trotsky, in the early period, the heroic and most revolutionary period of the Soviet regime, there was a flowering of expression. And why was that? Because for the first time ever, the Russian workers and peasants, who we have to remember were materially crushed by circumstances, not only did they have the heel of the Tsarist regime on their backs, the Okhrana, the secret police, the arbitrary arrests, the pogroms, all of that political repression, most of them couldn't read, couldn't write, they weren't allowed or weren't able to afford to go to Russia's theatres, to experience the wealth of culture that existed in Russian society. They had no voice. They were denied a voice. And the Bolsheviks changed all that. They opened the doors of the theatres, of the galleries. They carried out or tried to carry out a massive program of free education. They tried to provide the basis for people to finally have a voice. And there was an explosion of journals, of periodicals, even during the Civil War, where conditions were dire. And it's not just us saying this. I've got some quotes to prove it from people who wouldn't agree with us politically. So this was written by the Woodrow Wilson administration. They say, at the height of the war, since every army unit and local Soviet wanted to have its own paper, there was a great proliferation of publications. At the end of the Civil War, there were more periodicals printed in Russia than there had been in peacetime. And with regards freedom of expression in art and culture, This is from the conservative Oxford historian Max Hayward, so a British anti-communist historian. He says the revolutionary censorship's main function was to prevent the publication of overtly counter-revolutionary works. It did not interfere with basic literary freedom in matters of form and content, because there was repression of certain papers and points of view during the Civil War. And why was that? Because they were supporting the Tsarist counter-revolution. They were supporting the opposing army. You show me a country anywhere in the world that would allow, during a civil war, the other side to legally and freely print seditious material. It wouldn't be allowed. It would never happen. It wasn't allowed during the Second World War. It wasn't allowed during the American Civil War. You wouldn't have allowed German papers to publish pro-Nazi propaganda in the middle of World War II. It would have been insane. No government would have allowed that. But somehow, the Soviets are held to a different standard.
Yeah. Well, talking about the 1920s in the Soviet Union, this is sort of buried in the history books. They try not to highlight it. But what you were saying, after the revolution, there was actually a flourishing of art and literature, and journals about art, about literature, about different schools of thought. There were even journals that expressed different opinions, some of them more conservative, some of them more progressive, on different aspects. And I wrote a couple of articles on the question of the decriminalization of homosexuality in the Soviet Union, which happened in 1922 when they had the new constitution. That period saw a flourishing of different opinions and different schools, which was the height of the revolutionary period. Even in spite of what you said, the Civil War and all the rest of it, all the suffering, there was this, and it lasted, I would say, probably for about a decade, from the revolution to when it was finally snuffed out. And what you had, you had figures such as Kuzmin, who was a gay writer. He goes down in history having been the first to write a novel in which homosexual relationship is hinted at. I went and looked. I read it. Interesting little novel.
You said it was pretty tame by modern standards, right?
Yes, but it was interesting text for the period. When the revolution took place, Kuzmin stayed in the Soviet Union, became a member of the Literary Academy of the Soviet Union, was a respected figure and writer, would hold readings of his poetry and his writings in theatres, etc., lived openly with his partner, a gay couple. This was all part of that period. But from my reading, what I could see was you could see the future bureaucrats emerging. They tended to have more conservative views on certain matters, such as homosexuality, for example, or for instance, abortion. Abortion was granted in the Soviet Union very early on. Homosexuality was decriminalized. Women's rights were established in law. And by the time you get to the end of the 1920s, there's a big clampdown on all of this. Kuzmin was no longer allowed to give public readings of his poetry and his writings. And it was all snuffed out. All that flourishing of art and literature and debate. That was, that was the genuine Bolshevism. That was the genuine, not communism, because communism is an advanced form, but the genuine workers' power that existed. Going back to what we said earlier, as a bureaucratic elite began to emerge, with it came its conservatism. The more progressive journals were shut down. Eventually, we had in the 1930s the recriminalization of homosexuality, the abolition of the right of abortion, and a tightening up on family law, for example, i.e. a trend towards conservatism. It's surprising that the right wing should not like that, because some of the things that were adopted, for instance, a premium to women who had lots of children, When I read that, I thought, oh, this reminds me of a regime I knew in Italy.
Yeah.
The same thing. They wanted to have more babies, increase the population.
Well, Elon Musk is obsessed with people having lots of babies. He's always banging on about it.
Including himself.
Yes.
So the genuine spirit of the socialist revolution that took place in the Soviet Union, in Russia and then became the Soviet Union, was actually a flourishing of free speech. Mm-hmm. On art, for example, Lenin didn't impose his personal tastes, neither did Trotsky. Their view was artists and scientists must be free to develop their ideas. That's the only way of going forward. Once you have a privileged elite that can only maintain those privileges by clamping down on the rest of society, with it comes a conservatism and a tightening up and the imposition of a line. And then, of course, you must fight anybody that's fighting for an alternative idea. Any Bolsheviks who were just reminding people that what we fought for was something different and we want to go back to the genuine workers' control and workers' democracy, which becomes a material threat to the people who position themselves in the bureaucracy. At that point, you have to impose a restriction of free speech, censorship. You clamp down on any alternative opinions, and you only promote the one official opinion. And then, yes, of course, you had censorship and the end of free speech. That's not what communists fight for.
No, and as a matter of fact, I don't know whether Trump and Musk have noticed, but the USSR is long gone, and it's not people even purporting to be socialists who are clamping down on free speech. It's the capitalist politicians. And we understand as communists that democratic rights don't exist in a vacuum. They're not these naturally ordained rights that just exist whether or not we choose to fight for or defend them. They are weapons in the class struggle. We do support democratic rights. We do support free speech, but we do so with the understanding that the capitalists will provide a degree of free speech, but not to the point that what is being said seriously threatens their class interests. We defend free speech because it's a platform the working class can use to present its ideas and to fight for and to argue for a different form of society.
Well, things have worsened even under capitalism and even under so-called Western democracies. There was a time, at least in Western Europe, even in America, where they would tolerate even the most extreme opinions as long as they controlled the mainstream media and as long as it didn't threaten their system. But now we're seeing actually a tightening up. They are actually reducing the democratic right to free speech. We saw it on the question of Palestine very clearly, people being arrested just for a slogan, just for expressing an opinion. This is growing, and this is because the system has entered into a deep crisis. When you are in crisis, there's a tendency to, on the people at the top, the elite, the self-centered people, to go back to the first video, the people only think of themselves. And when they're only thinking of themselves as an elite, as a privileged class, they've got to look at every possible means to clamp down on any idea which threatens their privilege. And that includes clamping down on genuine free speech. And of course, you talk about free speech, you shout about it, but then in practice, you reduce it. We are for genuine free speech, which is the right of people to express their opinions, but also not just the right to express your opinion. Society should give access to media, to all the different groups in society, the different opinions. And one way of doing it would be to give people the right access to media outlets in proportion to the weight they have in society, to the support they have. You know, the occupied factories in South America, they should have been given the right to access the media, have a TV program in the evening which shows how the factory is run. Why wouldn't they let that happen? Wouldn't that be something nice to do and democratic and liberal? The problem is millions of people would see a factory being run in a completely different way, and they would say, That sounds good. That's a good idea. Maybe we should do it. That would mean expropriating the capitalists, unfortunately. Therefore, they will never allow that kind of media access to people with genuinely alternative ideas.
And I'll end with one more quote from a right-winger, which I feel is very appropriate to that point. So it's a response by Elon Musk to something that Jeremy Corbyn posted on Twitter. Reformist Jeremy Corbyn, not a communist, but nevertheless. He says, billionaires should not own social media platforms. Billionaires should not run our newspapers. Billionaires should not control our politics. Elon Musk's reply, should too. We'll see about that, Musk. Anyway, I think that's quite enough right-wingers for one series. Thanks once again, Fred. That was fantastic, and thank you all for watching. Tune in next week, and we'll be back for a new episode of The Spectre of Communism. See you then.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communist. The communist.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.